Rev up your engines!
Well, here we go. Proof that my videos are helping people fix their own cars. I got an email from John Peeling in Pennsylvania who says, Scotty, my recent connector problem with my battery was solved by watching your battery video. My scanner connectivity would not connect because my battery terminal was loose, like you said. My mechanic was treating the terminals with a purple substance, forgot to tighten them up. Thanks for your video, and I say problem fixed thanks to your video. Yeah, well, that's why I make them, to help people out. So many things out there that are hassle modern day. The last thing you want is a car that you got to spend a fortune fixing it, when it often can be a very simple thing. And in that case, it was the mechanic's fault. He put the purple stuff on. He didn't even tighten the terminals. Unfortunately, that happens more and more these days. People are too wrapped up with social media and whatever, and they're looking at their phone all the time. They're not even paying attention to the job they're supposed to do. Well, unless you're using your phone to watch car repair videos, my advice is don't use it unless you need it for a good reason. Watching my videos learn how to fix your cars. That's what I'm here for. Mr. Bob said, every time I change the coolant in any of my cars, the water pump started leaking a week later. 3 times, 2 Chevys and a Dodge. My wife's Santa Fe is 60K and I should be changed. I'm afraid. Well, I don't blame you. You had some bad experiences. Well, realize that the Asian cars are better built than the Chevys and Dodges by far. And they generally use a better coolant, too. Now, if you did the Chevys and the Dodge, if you actually flushed them and used the flush material, don't ever do that in modern vehicles. The flush can heat the seal on a water pump and then it will leak. You just want to drain and refill. With the Asians, their coolant is generally a little bit better. They have Asian specialized long life coolant. Some of it lasts as much as 7 years or 150,000 miles. So you don't have to change it all that often. You probably, if you did flush it, the flush ruined it. If not, it's just because the American stuff is kind of poorly made. And when you changed it out, it just caused a problem. But don't ever use flush on modern cars. Just drain and fill. Because the flush can ruin seals. It's too caustic. There's too much chemicals in it. Especially if you have some old flush lying around from years ago when you used actual acid. And the acid will eat a lot of that stuff up. So just drain and fill. Don't use any kind of flush. Mr. Bob says, I got a 10-year-old Santa Fe, 60,000 miles. I changed the pads and rotors. Brakes feel kind of spongy, but they still stop. Could it be the brake pads? My wife called the dealer and said they should flush the fluid. What do you think? It wasn't mushy before, right? And it is now. So it's not the fluid, because if it was the fluid, it would have been mushy the whole time. Here's what probably happened. If you change the brake pads, you got to squeeze the calipers back in, right? You're squeezing them. When you do that, you should open up a bleeder valve. So when you squeeze them in, then the pressure just comes out the bleeder valve and drips in a pan that you put under there. If you didn't and you just squeeze them, all that pressure shoots back up into the master cylinder, and sometimes it can do a little bit of damage to the master cylinder. You might try bleeding them just because you could do it yourself. Watch my video, how to bleed brakes in your car, Scotty. All 4 wheels. It's not rocket science, right? And if it stays that way, but it feels a little mushy, but it's safe, you could live with it. But if you want it tight and you bleed the brakes and it's still mushy, you'd have to replace the brake master cylinder, because that often can be damaged. Anytime you do a brake job, before you squeeze the calipers back in, open the bleeder valve, and then the pressure will go out there instead of back up, putting back pressure on the master cylinder. They're just rubber seals, and sometimes it can damage them. Gray 7 says they got 07 Ram 3500 dually with a 6.7 liter Ram Cummins diesel engine. I have P0251, P0087, and P102. I replaced the rebuilt HPFP, pressure regulator, the solid regulator, fuel rail pressure sensor. Help! Those codes show that there's a problem in the pressure system. Unfortunately, there's about 12 different things that can cause that. You got a Ram diesel with Cummins diesel engine, but it's a modern vehicle. It's not the old-fashioned mechanical stuff. That's electronic stuff. The electronic stuff is all computer controlled. You're going to need a real expert diesel mechanic who works on those Ram Cummins diesel engines to check it out, or you're just guessing. You guessed with parts and it didn't fix it. That's how complex modern diesels are. That's why I tell people. They're fine when they're new. When they get old and they start breaking down, you better find yourself a good diesel mechanic, because it can cost a fortune to repair them if you just start guessing with parts. They have a computer. They have years of experience. and the computer they have does bi-directional testing so they can check one. Is this working? Is that working? It's very complex stuff, very high-pressure system. You don't want to be guessing with expensive parts. It's unfortunate, but modern electronic diesels are not made for do-it-yourself repairs. That's just how they are. And all the modern diesel engines are that way. And they get more complex as it goes. They're trying to make it more efficient, so some of them have 2 or 3 different thermostats to be more efficient and use less heat wasted in the exhaust to reuse heat. They're very, very complex. When they get old and they break, they're going to cost a ton to fix, and only an expert could fix them without pure guesswork. Matt B says, big fan. I did a coolant flush my 09 Hyundai Sonata. I've had it for 3 years. It's been great. After I refilled and burped it, it goes to normal temperature of driving, but then it drops to dead cold. I thought it was the thermostat and got a new one and replaced it, but it's still doing it. Unless you got a bad thermostat. Relatively rare these days, but I mean, if it's easy to change, just replace the thermostat again. But I don't think it's going to fix it because you said it goes to 0. You probably have a bad temperature sending unit. The unit that bolts onto the engine sends the temperature reading to the gauge. And when that breaks, it'll sometimes short out. Or you got a wiring short. You might go to that sensor and you might see that you pull off the sensor wire, you might see it's all green and corroded or it's loose. You can just spray it with spray electrical cleaner, clean it with a little brush, then squeeze it with a pair of pliers to make it tighter and then snap it back on. It could just be that it's loose and corroded. If not, replace the temperature sending unit. That's probably your problem. If you have a bad thermostat, it's not going to go to 0. It's still going to have some, but if it goes to 0, the gauge itself is not working. Duma 444 says, Scotty, I'd like to buy a mini SUV for my family of 4. I don't want a big SUV because I live with tight roads in my tiny neighborhood. What do you think of the newest Suzuki Jimmy? And what's your thought on Suzuki cars in general? All right, well, you're obviously not in the United States because they don't sell those things there anymore. They're okay vehicles. I've got friends in Australia who own them and they like them. Someplace in Europe with tiny streets. They're decent vehicles. You know, they failed miserably in the United States because we like big, giant SUVs. We have giant, humongous roads with all kinds of space. I bet Texas probably has more roads than half of Europe. We want big things with big engines, and the small ones failed miserably, and the Suzuki cars failed miserably too because they're too small, too slow. Americans are lazy. We all drive automatic transmissions, and those things are horrible with automatics. They can't get out of their own way. But with the standard, they're zippy enough and fun to drive. But Americans don't like them. 96% of Americans drive automatics. In the United States, they fail. But in other countries, no. Could be a decent vehicle to drive around. There's people that know how to fix them. I was in the British Virgin Islands. They all had this Suzuki Samurai stuff. They loved them because guys knew how to get parts for them, knew how to fix them, and they didn't have to worry about it. But then again, you got an island that's like 3 miles wide and 20 miles long. There's not that much road to drive on. So they didn't fail like they did in the big old United States. D. Smith says, Scotty, got a funny question. It's cold here in Ohio. I checked out my vehicle's tire pressure. Of the 3 vehicles, I topped them off to spec and put the valve stem covers back on. Come the next morning and 2 tires on one car and one on the other's flat. What could have happened? All right, well, here's the thing. When you add the air in with the compressor, if you've ever felt it, the compressor, the hose and stuff will get a little bit warm because that's hot compressed air being compressed and thrown into the tire. So maybe there was some ice and that kind of melted it. But then when you took it off, if it's cold, the ice could have frozen. And it could have frozen to leave the valve stem inside seat, sticking on a little ice and not seated right, and then the air would have leaked out. That's the most common thing. I've seen that happen. The other would be, let's say they're really old tires with very old rotten valve stems. Just the fact of pushing the air in, you're pushing hard on that rubber valve stem, and if it's cracked, you might have cracked it more, and it might have cracked and you need new valve stems. More commonly, though, you would have gotten some water in there, and then it froze to ice, and then it leaked out. So the next time you do it, I would say, maybe have a little hair dryer and heat it up before you're done so it all stays melted on and doesn't have ice that's frozen and doesn't seat right, because with a hair dryer that would melt the ice and then you wouldn't have to worry about it not seating right. Now, if you wonder how these navigation systems in your car, you use your phone or use a system in a car, came about, you can thank the U.S. military because, believe it or not, way back in the 1930s, the Inter-Avto, which was an aftermarket device, had navigation guidelines by using scrolling paper maps and a speedometer cable connection. It was a dash-mounted device, and you could track a route. As long as you stayed in a straight and narrow, you couldn't turn over. Now make a U-turn in 100 yards. And no, you had to follow this thing. It's kind of like a AAA map when I was young, where you'd tell them where you're going, and they'd mail you a map, and your distance and all the driving directions were a dark red line that they put on the map to show where you started, where you're going to. Well, this one flipped the map as they were going for the military. And of course, now the really modern ones that they're built into the cars, like the new ones that I test out, they got it right on your windshield. It's a pop-up navigation, just like the fighter jets that have in a guy's head on the screen in front of his helmet, where he sees it and all the different targets and stuff. Well, they're all going that way now. Some of them even have a little thing that says the speed limit, and even if there's no speed signs outside, it knows what the speed limit is. And then when it changes, it tells you. And if you went from a 65 to a 50, the speed limit sign would flash because you're going over the 50 speed limit. So, you know, you can thank the military for all this stuff. And originally it was just a scrolling map. I've never actually seen one, but boy, I'd like to see one. I hope maybe somebody's got a link to a video of an actual one. Send it to me. I'd love to see how that original one worked. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.